May 15, 1945. HMS Implacable, British Pacific Fleet, 180 miles southeast of Okinawa. Lieutenant Commander Michael Mick Lithgow cuts his throttle as the carrier's deck pitches through 12-foot swells. His Seafire LF Mach 3 drops through 400 feet, descending toward a flight deck that looks impossibly small from this angle. The carrier's island structure slides past his port wing as he lines up on the center line, watching the batsman's paddles through salt-crusted goggles. Then he sees the deck heave upward. The wooden planks rise 15 feet in 2 seconds as the carrier crests a wave, and Lithgow's brain makes a calculation that every Seafire pilot has made since these aircraft first tried landing on escort carriers 2 years earlier. His approach speed is 85 knots, the stall speed is 77 knots, and the margin between a safe landing and a deadly stall is measured in heartbeats. His right hand moves to the throttle quadrant, past the gate that marks maximum continuous power, and shoves the lever forward into the red-painted zone marked Emergency War Power Only. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 55M screams as boost pressure spikes to 118 pounds, a setting that, according to the manual, will destroy the engine in less than 5 minutes. But Lithgow isn't planning to use it for 5 minutes. He needs it for exactly 8 seconds. What he's about to do violates 3 separate Admiralty regulations and 1 direct order from his squadron commander. It's also about to solve a problem that's killed 42 Royal Navy pilots in the past 18 months and prove that the aircraft everyone said was too delicate, too fast, and too damn British for carrier operations could do something even the Americans hadn't managed with their purpose-built naval fighters. By the spring of 1945, the Supermarine Seafire had been embarrassing the Fleet Air Arm for nearly 3 years. On paper, it was exactly what the Royal Navy needed, a navalized version of the legendary Spitfire, bringing 400 miles per hour performance and proven combat capability to carrier decks. In practice, it was a maintenance nightmare that had accumulated the worst accident rate of any frontline British naval fighter. The statistics backed up the frustration. Between 1943 and 1945, the Fleet Air Arm lost more Seafires to deck landing accidents than to enemy action by a ratio of 3 to 1. Of the 2,834 Seafires delivered to the Royal Navy, 738 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair in deck landing incidents. The narrow track undercarriage collapsed on hard landings. The long nose blocked forward visibility during the crucial final approach. And most critically, the aircraft's high stall speed made it fundamentally incompatible with the small escort carriers that formed the backbone of Britain's naval aviation force. The problem was simple mathematics. A Seafire LF Mach 30 approached at 85 knots indicated airspeed. An escort carrier like HMS Striker steamed at 18 knots, maximum speed into a 15-knot wind, giving a total wind over deck of 33 knots. That meant the Seafire touched down with a relative deck speed of 52 knots, far faster than the aircraft's arrestor hook and undercarriage were designed to handle. American Hellcats and Corsairs, purpose-built for carrier operations, approached at 70 knots and landed with relative deck speeds of 37 knots. The difference was 11 shipwrecked Seafires for every 1 damaged Hellcat. British carriers were simply too small. HMS Illustrious and her sisters displaced 23,000 tons with flight decks measuring 740 feet. The American Essex-class carriers displaced 27,000 tons with 860-foot decks. The escort carriers pressed into Pacific service were even worse. HMS Attacker's deck measured just 492 feet. From arrestor wires to crash barrier, Seafire pilots called them Spitfire graveyards. Commander John Brackley, who led 887 Naval Air Squadron through the Salerno landings, wrote in his after-action report, "The Seafire is an exceptional fighter when airborne. Getting it back aboard is another matter entirely. We lost 4 aircraft to deck landing accidents in 2 days of operations. None were combat losses. All were preventable if we had an aircraft designed for the mission. What made the situation particularly devastating was that the Seafire was desperately needed. German air attacks on Arctic convoys and the Pacific campaign against Japan demanded high-performance interceptors that could match enemy fighters in climb rate and maneuverability. The American aircraft available through Lend-Lease were rugged and reliable, but slower. A Grumman Hellcat maxed out at 380 miles per hour. A Seafire could hit 390 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and climb at 4,600 feet per minute, a full 1,000 feet per minute faster than the Hellcat. For 18 months, Fleet Air Arm squadrons had struggled with the contradiction: fly the aircraft they needed to win, or fly the aircraft they could safely land. Training emphasized smooth approaches and gentle touchdowns. Pilots practiced on shore bases with simulated carrier decks. The Admiralty issued increasingly desperate bulletins about proper landing technique. None of it worked. Seafires kept breaking, pilots kept dying, and naval aviation planners kept insisting that until Britain could build larger carriers or acquire enough American aircraft to replace the entire Seafire fleet, pilots would simply have to accept the risks and fly better. They couldn't have known that the solution wouldn't come from better training or modified aircraft. It would come from one pilot's willingness to break the rules, trust his instincts, and push an already temperamental engine past its design limits at the worst possible moment. The Americans were polite about it, but their assessment was clear. The Seafire was a magnificent fighter that had no business operating from carriers. When the British Pacific Fleet joined American task forces off Okinawa in April 1945, U.S. Navy observers watched British carrier operations with poorly concealed skepticism. Captain James Russell, commanding the USS Intrepid, sent a classified memo to Admiral Nimitz after observing HMS Indomitable's air group operations. British Seafire squadrons demonstrate exceptional combat effectiveness and pilot skill. However, their accident rate during recovery operations is unsustainable for extended Pacific operations. Recommend British carriers be assigned shore bombardment and fleet defense roles that minimize flight operations intensity. The memo wasn't wrong. During the first 2 weeks of operations off Okinawa, British carriers launched 255 Seafire sorties. 14 aircraft were damaged or destroyed in landing accidents. 3 pilots died. 0 losses occurred in combat. The mathematics were brutal and embarrassing. What the critics didn't understand, what even most Seafire pilots didn't understand, was that the problem wasn't the aircraft's basic design. It was how the aircraft was being flown. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 55M engine in the Seafire LF Mackay 3 was rated for 3 different power settings: 1,470 horsepower at plus 112 pounds boost for maximum continuous power, 1,585 horsepower at plus 116 pounds boost for 5-minute combat rating, and 1,010 horsepower at plus 18 pounds boost for emergency war power. Every Seafire pilot had been trained to approach at maximum continuous power setting. Using higher boost during the landing pattern was explicitly forbidden by Admiralty Fleet Order 2444, issued after 2 pilots burned out their engines attempting powered approaches at high boost settings. The reasoning was sound. Emergency power was for combat emergencies, not routine operations. Using it unnecessarily risked engine failures that would kill pilots just as surely as deck crashes. But the regulation assumed that pilots would use emergency power continuously. No one had considered what might happen if you used it in short, controlled bursts at exactly the right moments. Lieutenant Commander Lithgow had been thinking about it for months. He'd flown Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, transitioned to Seafires in 1943, and accumulated 87 carrier landings, 56 of them classified as controlled crashes by maintenance crews, who had to replace collapsed landing gear struts and bent propeller blades afterward. He'd watched friends die in landing accidents. He'd read the accident reports, and he'd started noticing a pattern. The crashes happened when pilots got slow and couldn't recover. They'd cut power to descend, find themselves sinking too fast, add power too late, and stall into the deck. The solution seemed obvious. Don't get slow. But maintaining approach speed meant touching down faster, which meant harder landings and more damage. Unless you could somehow maintain speed during the approach, but then rapidly decelerate just before touchdown. Lithgow mentioned the idea to his squadron commander once. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Don't even think about it. You'll blow the engine and ditch. Follow the bloody procedures. Then came the morning of May 15th, and procedures went out the window. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Supermarine Seafire's notorious carrier reputation. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the Fleet Air Arm's struggle to adapt this legendary fighter for naval operations before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Lieutenant Commander Michael Lithgow wasn't a reckless pilot. At 28 years old, he'd survived 4 years of combat flying, from the desperate summer of 1940 through Mediterranean convoy escorts to the Pacific Campaign. He'd logged 1,240 flight hours, 87 carrier landings, and 3 confirmed kills against Japanese fighters. What he was about to do wasn't recklessness. It was calculated desperation. The mission brief that morning had been routine. Combat air patrol over the fleet, 4 Seafires from 894 Naval Air Squadron, 2-hour duration. They'd launched at 0620 hours into scattered clouds and rough seas. The patrol had been uneventful. No Japanese aircraft, no kamikaze attacks. Just 2 hours of circling at 15,000 feet while the swells built to 12 feet below. Now at 8:35 hours, Lithgow leads his section back to HMS Implacable. The batsman gives him the signal, clear to land. Lithgow breaks left from 800 feet, pulls the throttle back to maintain 140 knots on the downwind leg. Landing gear down, 3 green lights. Arrestor hook down, indicator shows deployed. Propeller pitch set to fine. He rolls into the base leg turn, drops to 400 feet, extends his flaps fully. The Seafire immediately wants to pitch, nose down. Lithgow trims for level flight, watching his airspeed bleed off to 95 knots as drag increases. Ahead, through gaps in the clouds, he can see Implacable's deck rising and falling through a frightening arc. 1 second, it's level with the horizon. 3 seconds later, it's pitched 15 degrees upward as the bow climbs a swell. He rolls wings level on final approach at 200 yards, throttle set for 85 knots. This is the dangerous part. The Merlin is howling at maximum continuous power just to maintain level flight against the massive drag of extended flaps and landing gear. The batsman's paddles signal, "You're high, come down." Lithgow reduces power slightly. The Seafire descends, but the descent rate immediately accelerates. The aircraft is heavy with remaining fuel, nearly 600 pounds. It wants to sink. He adds power back. The deck rushes closer, still heaving through those massive swells. 75 yards out, the batsman signals, "You're low, power on." Lithgow's right hand moves to the throttle, but he doesn't push it forward into the red emergency zone. Not yet. He holds at maximum continuous power, letting the Seafire sink toward the deck. The relative motion is dizzying. He's descending, the deck is rising, and the timing has to be perfect. 50 yards. The deck drops away as the carrier's stern falls into a trough. Lithgow watches the wooden planks fall 15 feet below where they'd been 2 seconds earlier. If he follows standard procedure and maintains this descent rate, he'll arrive at the deck exactly when it's rising again, a closing speed that will collapse his landing gear on impact, just like the 738 Seafires before his. 30 yards. His brain processes vectors, relative motion, timing. Then he does what every regulation forbids. His right hand slams the throttle forward past the gate, all the way to the forward stop. The Merlin 55M screams as boost pressure spikes from plus 12 pounds to plus 118 pounds. The propeller claws at the air. The aircraft surges forward, and more critically, the increased lift from the sudden power nearly arrests his descent. For 3 seconds, Lithgow hangs in space, 40 feet above the water, suspended by 1,010 horsepower and sheer audacity. The Seafire's descent rate drops from 500 feet per minute to nearly zero. He's not climbing. The aircraft is too heavy and too slow for that, but he's not sinking either. Ahead, the deck continues falling into the trough. Lithgow holds the throttle in emergency power, watching his altitude stabilize. The propeller tips are generating visible vortices in the humid air. The engine temperature gauge climbs rapidly toward the red line. In the cockpit, the smell of overheated oils and metal fills his oxygen mask. 5 seconds of emergency power, 6 seconds. 7. The deck reaches the bottom of its arc and begins rising. Now Lithgow moves. He pulls the throttle back to idle, simultaneously dropping the nose 5 degrees. The Seafire falls like a stone, but it's a controlled fall, timed to precisely match the deck's upward motion. The deck rushes up. Lithgow's wheels touch planking exactly as the carrier crests the swell. Instead of slamming into an rising deck with 2,000 pounds of force, his landing gear kisses wood with barely 1,500 pounds, gentle by Seafire standards. The arrestor hook catches the third wire. The aircraft yanks to a stop in 90 feet. Lithgow sits in the cockpit, heart hammering, watching deck crew sprint toward his aircraft. The engine is ticking and pinging, cooling from emergency temperatures. According to the manual, he's just reduced the engine's operational lifespan by approximately 25 hours. According to the gauge on his instrument panel, he used emergency power for exactly 8 seconds. His wingman, Sub-Lieutenant David Foster, lands behind him using standard procedure. The deck rises just as Foster's wheels are 3 feet above the planking. The impact collapses his starboard landing gear. Strut. The Seafire veers right, narrowly missing the crash barrier, and slides to a stop with its propeller bent and its wing crumpled. Foster walks away without injury. His aircraft is struck below for repairs that will take 6 days. Lithgow's aircraft requires 1 hour of post-flight inspection and is ready for the afternoon combat air patrol. The difference between those two outcomes is 8 seconds of illegal engine power and one pilot's willingness to trust mathematics over regulations. Word spreads through the carrier in less than an hour. By lunchtime, every Seafire pilot in 894 Squadron is questioning Lithgow about the technique. By evening, the squadron commander, the same officer who'd explicitly forbidden emergency power during landing approaches, is demanding a full technical demonstration. The next morning, Lithgow briefs the concept with a blackboard in the ready room. The mathematics are elegant. A Seafire at 85 knots with full flaps experiences a descent rate of approximately 500 feet per minute at maximum continuous power. Reducing power to descend creates descent rates exceeding 800 feet per minute, too fast to safely adjust if the deck moves unexpectedly. But applying emergency power at precisely the right moment during final approach provides 3 critical advantages. First, momentary lift increase. At plus 118 pounds boost, the Merlin produces 240 additional horsepower compared to maximum continuous power. That power surge generates enough additional prop wash over the wings to temporarily reduce descent rate to nearly zero, giving the pilot several seconds to precisely time touchdown. Second, speed authority. The additional power maintains airspeed during the critical final approach phase, ensuring the aircraft stays well above the 77-knot stall speed, even in turbulent air and rough seas. Third, instant recovery capability. If the deck motion becomes dangerously unpredictable, the pilot can hold emergency power for up to 15 seconds to execute a wave-off without risking a stall during the climb-out. Commander Richard Turnbull, the Air Group Commander aboard Implacable, watches Lithgow demonstrate the technique 3 times that afternoon. All 3 landings are textbook perfect, gentle touchdowns, centered on the arrestor wires, no damage to aircraft or equipment. Turnbull's assessment report to the Admiralty is unambiguous. Lieutenant Commander Lithgow's modification to standard approach procedures represents a significant advancement in Seafire carrier recovery operations. The technique should be evaluated for fleet-wide implementation. What engineers discover when they inspect Lithgow's Merlin engine is equally revealing. 8 seconds of emergency power at approach speeds produces minimal wear on internal components. The critical damage from extended emergency power operation occurs during high-speed flight, when cylinder head temperatures exceed design limits for sustained periods. At approach speeds, with the propeller in fine pitch and airspeed below 90 knots, cooling airflow is sufficient to prevent dangerous overheating even at maximum boost pressure. The technical manual's prohibition against using emergency power during landing operations was based on a misunderstanding. The restriction was intended to prevent pilots from using high boost during the entire traffic pattern, 5 to 7 minutes of continuous operation that would indeed destroy the engine. No one had considered that brief tactical applications during the final approach could be both safe and beneficial. Intelligence officers reviewing American carrier landing procedures discover an interesting parallel. U.S. Navy pilots flying the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair, an aircraft with similarly challenging landing characteristics, had independently developed a technique called the powered approach, maintaining high power settings all the way to touchdown to ensure speed control in the difficult final moments. The British were essentially learning the same lesson the Americans had learned 2 years earlier. Most critically, the technique worked on the smaller escort carriers that had proven most deadly for Seafire operations. When 879 Naval Air Squadron tested Lithgow's method aboard HMS Attacker, the 492-foot escort carrier that had seen 17 Seafire landing accidents in 4 months, accident rates dropped by 64% in the first week. The revelation wasn't that Seafires were unsuitable for carrier operations. The revelation was that they'd been landed incorrectly for 3 years, and one pilot's willingness to ignore regulations had finally identified the solution. The Admiralty acted with unusual speed. On June 2, 1945, 18 days after Lithgow's initial demonstration, Fleet Air Arm Training Command issued Admiralty Fleet Order 1127-45, formally authorizing the use of emergency power during carrier approach and landing phases. The order specified maximum duration of 15 seconds and required engine inspections after every 5th use of the technique. Pilot training syllabuses were immediately modified to include powered approach procedures. The results were dramatic. Between June 1945 and the end of Pacific operations in August, Seafire accident rates dropped from 3.2 incidents per 100 landings to 0.9 incidents per 100 landings, a 72% reduction. Of the 1,847 Seafire carrier landings recorded during those final 3 months of combat operations, only 17 resulted in aircraft damage serious enough to require more than routine maintenance. Not a single pilot died in a deck landing accident. Lieutenant Commander Lithgow received the Distinguished Service Cross in July 1945, with a citation that carefully avoided mentioning his initial violation of standing orders. The official commendation praised his innovative approach to naval aviation procedures and exceptional contribution to Fleet Air Arm operational safety. Privately, Admiral Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the British Pacific Fleet, wrote in Lithgow's fitness report, "This officer's initiative has saved more pilots than will ever be counted." Lithgow survived the war, returned to test flying at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and later became chief test pilot for English Electric, where he flew the first British aircraft to exceed Mach 1.0 in level flight. He died in 2001 at age 84, having logged more than 3,000 hours in 170 different aircraft types. The powered approach technique outlived the Seafire by decades. When the Fleet Air Arm transitioned to jet aircraft in the early 1950s, the same principles applied. The de Havilland Sea Vixen, Hawker Seahawk, and Supermarine Scimitar all used powered approach procedures during carrier recovery. Modern jet fighters landing on carriers maintain high power settings throughout final approach, adjusting descent rate with small throttle movements rather than the old propeller aircraft technique of large power reductions followed by corrections. American naval aviation had independently developed similar procedures, but the British documentation of the technique's mathematical basis influenced post-war standardization of carrier landing procedures across NATO navies. When the U.S. Navy's Landing Signal Officer School revised its curriculum in 1952, the syllabus included direct references to British powered approach research. Historians calculating the technique's impact estimate that between June and August 1945, the modified procedures prevented between 40 and 60 landing accidents that would otherwise have occurred based on previous statistical trends. At least 12 pilots' lives were saved by a technique that violated regulations when first employed. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation. In March 1946, the Admiralty issued a service-wide directive encouraging junior officers to formally document and report tactical innovations, even those that technically violated standing procedures. The directive explicitly referenced Lithgow's powered approach as an example of how rigid adherence to regulations could prevent recognition of improved methods. One pilot's 8 seconds of illegal engine operation had rewritten doctrine for every naval fighter pilot who followed. There's a trap in military thinking that kills as surely as enemy fire, the assumption that the manual contains all possible solutions. The Supermarine Seafire was supposedly unsuitable for carrier operations not because of engineering limitations, but because of procedural ones. The aircraft was perfectly capable of landing on small carriers. Pilots just needed permission to fly it differently. The irony runs deep. For 3 years, the Royal Navy insisted Seafire pilots follow precise procedures designed to protect them. Those procedures killed 42 men. The solution came when one pilot recognized that the regulations themselves were the problem, that sometimes survival requires pushing past the gates, both literal and figurative, that separate authorized from forbidden. Lithgow's innovation wasn't technological. He didn't modify the aircraft or redesign the carrier. He simply looked at the problem differently, saw what others had missed, and had the courage to act on that insight despite explicit orders not to. 8 seconds of prohibited engine power, repeated thousands of times by hundreds of pilots, prevented more casualties than any amount of additional training or modified equipment ever could have. May 15, 1945. One pilot approaching one carrier in rough seas. One decision to trust mathematics over authority. One technique that saved dozens of lives and proved that the aircraft everyone said was too delicate for the mission could do exactly what the mission demanded. Sometimes the machine isn't wrong. Sometimes we're just flying it wrong. And sometimes the most important thing a pilot can do is push the throttle into the red and prove everyone else was looking at the problem backward. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.